We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG.vision. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, welcome to the SDG Vision podcast. I'm Pierre Jones, and today we're really thrilled to have the CEO of the New Economics Foundation and author of the newly published book, Power to the People, Danny Sriskandarajah. Hello, Danny.
Hi, Pierre. Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you as well, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very excited and really happy to be talking about it with you and your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully we can also talk about the work of the New Economics Foundation as well, because I'm sure it dovetails quite nicely with a lot of the issues that you raise in the book. So with the book, Power to the People, it's, well, some people say, never judge a book by its cover, Danny. And you've got what I would say a bold title, and you've got a bold image. And some may say that that's provocative, provocatively done. What would you say?
Yeah, it's deliberately provocative and, well spotted. In fact, the original title for the book was going to be The Century of the Citizen. And that's because I still believe that this should be the century of the citizen, right? This is the century when all of us, all around the world, should have our basic needs met, when we should be living in free and democratic societies, where we should be connected digitally and in real life with each other, and sort of celebrating sort of humanity's successes. Now, as you know, the book is in some ways also is a lament at what's going wrong, and how it's, as things stand, it's not looking like it's going to be the century of the citizen. And I'm sure we'll come to talk about that. But my editor thought that might have been a little bit academic, and he really did want to sort of catch people's eye. This was a book written for people, who aren't in my world, who don't work for a non-profit, who don't think about civil society day in, day out. And we settled on Power to the People because it is a sort of provocative phrase, but I really mean power to the people. This is, we should, all of us, be thinking about how do we empower people around the world so that people across the planet feel more connected to their political systems, have greater say and participation in their economic life, on the global stage, in the digital arena, because in all of those at the moment, it feels like we're being systematically disempowered. And so that's why it's called Power to the People.
I think it was a wise choice. I really do. I think that it is almost a clarion call, I think, really, to be honest with you. And it does say, use your voice, change the world at the bottom as well, which I think really identifies the fact that we're all in this together. I know that phrase is most closely associated with David Cameron, and we perhaps want to forget that, but we really are. And I think that I congratulated you because I think it's an important book. I read it, I devoured it really quickly, actually, because it's beautifully written, it's engaging. And as you say, I think that it will be hugely informative for people who've never read something like this before. I mean, you mentioned E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful in the book, and that hit the chord with me because I'm old enough, to have been alive in the 70s, and that was a foundational book for me. And I think this is going to be that book for this generation. So let's sort of explore it a little bit, if that's all right with you. On SDG Vision, generally speaking, we showcase people and organizations who are making positive contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we don't often just talk about the problems and the issues that confront us at the current time. However, I think it's useful that we do that from time to time because, well, for the very simple reason that these challenges and threats change. And it was really interesting that, Schumacher would not really have known much about artificial intelligence and the threat and the promises that can bring to people and the planet. So perhaps, Danny, could you sort of, I know it's difficult because we've only got a short period of time, but give an overview of what you see or what you write about in the book as the main threats and challenges that we're currently faced with.
Yeah, no, look, and as you know, the book was supposed to be about inspiring change and showing examples of people doing amazing things, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But before I could get to that, I had to sort of come to terms with why I think things are going wrong, right? I mean, why is it not shaping up to be the century of the citizen? And one of those reasons is that civic freedoms, the fundamental rights that each of us should have to organize, to speak out, to assemble peacefully, to protest, to speak truth to power, those freedoms are under threat almost everywhere in the world. Civicus, the organization I used to work for, produces something called the Civicus Monitor, which looks at these civic freedoms in every country of the world. And turns out, according to the latest monitor, only 3% of people on the planet live in countries that are considered truly open in terms of civic space. And the rest of us, including us here in the United Kingdom, are living in societies where one or more of those freedoms is being undermined by regulations on our rights to assemble, undermined because freedom of expression is being threatened, undermined in some countries because protesters are being, jailed or killed. Environmentalists, journalists, and others are under attack for speaking truth to power. NGOs, non-profits that are daring to speak out about human rights abuses or environmental damage are being shut down or slowed down through bureaucratic means, or their funding is being taken away from them. And so one of the fundamental things that I think is going on is a sort of a steady, concerted, and almost universal threat to these fundamental freedoms. And unless we protect those freedoms, we're not going to have a hope in hell of achieving all of the rest of the SDGs, because citizen participation, I would argue, underpins all of the goals in one way or another, and certainly a free and independent civil society, social movements and non-profits, charities and others are a critical part of achieving sustainable development or Agenda 2030. And so that's one. Secondly, you talked about AI and machines. We're living in a digital era that has unimaginable potential and possibility. And already, in my lifetime, life has changed so fundamentally because of the digital transformation in hugely positive ways, but also in some worrying ways. And I think I'm an optimist. I like technology. I think we can't put the technology genie back in the bottle, but we do need to think about how do we protect fundamental human rights, especially privacy, but also how do we, sometimes I worry that, the machines are getting smarter, but we humans are being treated as if we're dumber. We're just being fed algorithmic content. We're being used. Our eyeballs are being sold by tech platforms that want to, sell us advertising on the premise that we're there, socializing and sharing content with each other. The good news is I think with a few changes, we can start to, harness the potential of the digital realm. And so, those are two dimensions of what I think are going on. A third, just briefly, is around the state of democracy. I suspect, many people will have heard that this year, 2024, is supposed to be the sort of festival of democracy. 2 billion of us are going to the polls in elections around the world, the biggest year of democratic elections. And yet, almost everywhere in the world, we're seeing rising levels of voter apathy. People not voting because they're not enthused by the political choices that they have. They don't trust politicians. They don't trust the political institutions. And so I think it's also an opportunity for us to reimagine democracy at the national level, at the community level, maybe even at the global level, so that we can, again, deliver more power to the people in more creative ways, so that we can meet the sort of thirst for participation that's not being met by today's institutions and today's mechanisms. So that's another thing that I worry about.
That's enough, I think, really, to be worried about. It seems to me, I mean, as you said, that, I mean, it's actually quite shocking to hear that only 3% of people are living in a true democracy. And I think most people would be shocked by that. And people think, well, if Trump gets in the States, then, that's going to be a real challenge and threat to democracy. But as you quite rightly say, actually, let's look at where we live and the slow erosion of democracy. So you identify, I think, in the book really clearly where power is located. It's located in the institutions, in the political process, the political institutions that claim to represent us, and with the extreme wealthy. I heard the other day that, it's something I was familiar with, but 50% of the land owned in Britain is owned by 1% of the people. And that's quite shocking when you think about how much power such a small number of people have. So you also say in the book, you talk about civil society and as a network, and we need to grow that network. And you say that at times it feels like push needs to come to shove in terms of wresting back democracy and re-establishing or reimagining a new way forward for people and the planet. How do you think, presumably you're not advocating violent, bloody revolution here. Your fist on the front is a green fist. I'm not saying that a red fist would necessarily, signify bloody revolution, but obviously power, by its very nature, people who have power, institutions that have power, they're very reluctant to actually give it away. So how do you think, you've mentioned civil society and networks, etc. How do you think that we can sort of wrest some of that power back for people and planet?
So an interesting observation about the fist on the cover. That was we debated long and hard about what image would do it, and we settled on that because, I think it does feel like push is coming to shove, and that in many parts of the world, people do need to reclaim power, particularly political power, from the institutions that, in many parts of the world feel corrupt or outdated, or, just cumbersome. And we've seen across the world throughout history, there have been these fabulous moments when people have risen up against feudalism, against autocracy, against dictatorships. And in many parts of the world, we've seen in the recent decades that is happening, right? And so I do the number of protests around the world in the last 2 decades, by one estimate, is more than I think the previous century put together, right? Yeah. So across the world, we're seeing this sort of rising up of people who are in some cases angry or frustrated with how things are going. And so let's call that the sort of sharp end of civil society. And that sharp end and that right to peaceful protest, to speak truth to power, all of that is critical. And that, my first point around civic space is that we need to be really careful to protect those freedoms. And yes, protesters can be inconvenient, they can block roads, they can close down an art gallery, whatever else it is. But it's an inconvenience that's often worth the price because they're fighting for the freedoms, and those fundamental freedoms are important to us. But then the sharp end, the fist, if you will, I've come to realize, particularly in writing the book, that only emerges when you've got a vibrant undergrowth. That's a sort of mixing of metaphors, but sure. I love that analogy that mushrooms, for example, sprout up, often after a rain, or but they sprout up from a vast underground network, the mycelial network, the fungal network that powers nature in many ways. You don't see it normally, But without it, you wouldn't have the mushrooms. And so I think for me, the second sort of learning is that we also have to nurture the undergrowth of civic life, that the things that we all do, the things we volunteer for, the ways in which we connect with our local community members, the way that we get passionate about the things we, care about or angrier about, all of that's important, and we need to pay attention to that. We need to be deliberate and intentional to nurture and promote the undergrowth of civic life, because without it, you're not going to get to the sort of the pointy bits, the bits that are necessary to take back power, if you will, or to push for real change. And then my third learning, which is really unexpected in sort of reading the book in some ways, and another reason why the power bit is there, is we do often talk about sort of taking power, power over things, power that is held in institutions. That's hugely important. But in some ways, I think humanity is also at a crossroads where we've got to work out how better to channel other forms of power. Experts often talk about power with, the power in, the power within, right? And for me, ultimately, it's called power to the people, because I think that, each of us has the power within us to change the world. And there have been amazing people in history that we celebrate today: Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Rosa Parks, even people like Greta Thunberg today, Malala Yousafzai. They're all people who I don't think, from what I've read about any of them, that they would have thought at the start of their journey into activism that they were going to deliver such profound change or be such prominent and celebrated figures. They were just ordinary people, going about their ordinary life, but getting frustrated, angry, inspired, whatever else it is, to do these things. And so if you buy this thesis that we're living in a world where more and more of us feel more and more disempowered, disillusioned with the system, then yes, ultimately it's about taking back power from these institutions that are hoarding them, political and economic institutions, as you say, addressing inequality. But ultimately, this is about human flourishing. It's also something, as you know, E.F. Schumacher was very concerned about, that we as a species will not flourish unless we nurture that inner sense of agency. And that's my ultimate worry, is we're building political systems and economic systems and digital environments that are sucking agency out of us. Yeah. And we as a species will thrive when we connect with each other and build things. We're social animals who are good at solving collective challenges. And if we're going to have any chance of delivering the SDGs, for example, yes, we need more resources. Yes, we need political and economic institutions to lean into the goals. But I would argue, yes, we also need to pay attention to human flourishing, that truly sustainable development will also need us to to nurture the sort of human flourishing through empowering all of us and finding sometimes new ways in which we can do things together in creative ways. And so that's how I see so the fist is out there on the front. It's the sort of prominent, recognizable mushroom, if you will. But beneath this, it's this undergrowth that's, the people-powered undergrowth that we would really do well to nurture and grow.
Yeah, and that's so you're looking at sort of bottom up rather than top down. People doing it for themselves and being able to do it for themselves. But that's a process, isn't it? It's a process. It's not something that will happen overnight. And you write, and I really liked the observation that you had in the book, that we need to develop a new narrative, you said. And that really struck a chord with me as an old man that has been around and politically active in the 80s. And other people who have been fighting for positive change since then. We've kind of failed to do that. We've kind of failed to excite and engage people with a new vision. And what I like in your book also, you say that, look, our society, we get up in the morning, we go to our work, we do whatever. And everything seems so naturally placed in the sense that, well, this is the system we have, this is the education we have, this is what it is, And we forget that actually this is all human-made. They're human-made constructs. So that's why the new narrative thing really struck a note with me. And then I thought, well, how do we do that? And as you said, that we need to enable and empower people. And it seems to me that we're at a profound moment where we almost need to change consciousness almost amongst people. And as soon as I said that, I've just sort of heard myself, and I thought, well, a lot of people will think that's a bit of woo-woo, a bit of almost sort of hippie-ish talk. But I think it's a profound thing, and that means, on a very basic level, how we perceive the world and our place in the world, and the society that we live in, kind of encourages people to think of themselves as isolated individuals who are should only be concerned about their own well-being, their own, and enrich themselves materially, etc. And I think that, as you said, that network and that sort of fungal growth, it's more about understanding how we relate to others and how we relate to the planet, our environment, which changes, and so we change. So how do you, I don't know whether you agree with that, but how do you think we can excite, engage, and enable people to reimagine, to see anew, and to actually see that, yes, we can change this and things, and you rightly say, the resources are there on this planet for all of us to lead healthy, meaningful, fulfilling lives.
Yeah.
I think you may have answered it in terms of the networks, etc. But could you perhaps expand on that? How we do the process?
Well, look, I think there's, your point around the sort of this isn't just a bunch of sort of old men wishing for the past, by the way. Although, it's weird. I didn't like history as a child, but I'm fascinated by history today because I'm constantly stumbling upon examples in human history where we've done things fundamentally differently from the way we do them today, or we're expected to do them today. Yeah. And let's take economics, for example. This sort of homo economicus, this idea that humans are just in it for self-interest, that we're profit maximizers, will live with intolerable levels of inequality, is not the norm for most of human history, right? Yes, there were people who were exploiting others and there were power structures that were very unhealthy, but there are also examples when we lived in much more communitarian setups where, here in the UK, there have been cooperatives for centuries, and even today, several percent of the British GDP is generated by cooperatives where members own the organization, where workers are much more actively, own the production. And so, the fact that the way we organize in sort of society, and particularly the economy, is not fixed. And so, to me, the point of the book, in many ways, the point of the work that I'm doing at the moment at the New Economics Foundation, is to show that another world is possible, right? That actually, we can organize things in new and creative ways, and it won't take very much. Take digital tools, for example. We're all familiar with big global brands like Amazon or Alibaba, which are sort of corporate platforms that are trading platforms where people consume, that we've lost sight of the sort of where those products come from, the environmental impact, the impact on workers and whatever else it is. There's an example I refer to in the book, which is a Turkish example called Good for Trust, which is they call it it's a platform cooperative. So instead of a platform in which sort of random, faceless, nameless sort of sellers sell to random consumers, they like to think of themselves as creating prosumers, producers and consumers who come together on a digital platform to buy and sell and trade. But the consumer has much more oversight about what the production, the sort of the genesis of the produce that they're buying, but also can shape what sort of things they want produced. So if you're interested in, say, vegetables or whatever else it is, you can say, look, I really like this type of apple or this type of carrot or whatever. and I can place an order with you, the farmer or the grower, to be able to, guarantee you some, orders in the future, which is sort of how villages would have worked in many, for most of human history. But they're using digital tools to connect people across Turkey to be able to do that. And to me, it's like, so it's going back to the basics of how you would consume. It's still about people, producing things and consuming things, but in a much more connected way, hopefully in a much more sustainable way, and definitely in a much more empowering way. And in a way where the profits from that platform are actually then distributed across all of the members, not extracted by shareholders who are sitting in Silicon Valley or wherever else and accumulating billions and billions of dollars because everyone else is consuming on their platforms or trading on their platforms. So that's a small example, but to me, a powerful one, that with a few tweaks to the way that we do things, we can create far more interesting, emancipatory mechanisms in which we will feel more empowered and connected and still be able to consume the things we want to consume.
Yeah, I think that's important, isn't it? Because often that's the point where people can turn off. If they say, well, you just want to stop me having fun and enjoying life, well, you can still have that. But actually the way of producing it can be far more egalitarian and far more responsive to consumer need. I mean, on the channel, we've got examples of, for example, local solar farms, etc., that community-owned solar farms. We've got examples of cooperatives. I mean, that's why we set up the channel, to show that actually this whole process of transformation, the answer's already within us. It just needs to be birthed, really, doesn't it? I mean, as you say, cooperatives have been around for centuries and they've been very successful.
Well, community energy is a great example. The one you just, I think that's a sort of a win-win-win, right? Of the clearest sort of example where, investing in renewable energy, wind farms or solar farms or whatever else it is, will help us deliver a green transition that we urgently need. But making sure that the ownership of that infrastructure is held at the community level will avoid the sort of big agglomeration that we're seeing in many parts of the global economy. And then the third win is those communities feel strengthened because they own assets together and they've got control. So instead of feeling like you're just a sort of distant consumer from this massive company buying energy, you're co-producing it. You're involved in a sort of more democratic way. And so you're addressing the green transition, you're devolving economic power, and you're helping people feel more connected to their communities. And we should be thinking about how to do that in other parts of the economy or other parts of society. And, and it's a sort of, so therefore we deliver on the what, raising incomes, delivering a green transition, but also on the how, empowering and connecting people as we go.
Absolutely. And also it avoids, that whole sort of NIMBYism of we don't want solar panels in our backyard because they're owned by this huge corporation. But actually, if they're producing power for your community, you'll be proud of them. They won't be a blot on the landscape. They'll be a sort of symbol of progressive sort of energy and move forward. So, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And I think that you say, that I think a lot of what you say really relates more strongly to the young, I think, to young people who often actually are far more, they get it and they run with new solutions, perhaps more than an old fogey like me. But I wonder how, and it strikes me, the obvious thing is that young people, in terms of developing a new narrative, that it's essential that young people are part of that, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to live in the world. And I was going to say the world that we've created. It's not the world that we've created. It's the world that corporations, the economic structure, the political system has created and made a mess of, frankly. But nevertheless, they're going to have to live in it. So really, they should be at the forefront of developing this new narrative. How do you think we can excite and enable young people to do that?
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating that, one of the things I've discovered in writing the book is also that, I was trying to understand, why do I feel optimistic or hopeful? Yeah. And I think it's partly because I feel incredibly lucky. I was born in Sri Lanka in the 1970s. because my family were lucky enough to leave Sri Lanka when there was a time of, civil war and huge upheaval. We ended up living in a stable, modern democracy in Australia, and now I live in the UK. I've had all these wonderful opportunities, and I've lived through a period of human history where, there has been economic growth and technological development and all those wonderful things that we've seen. But yet my lifetime, I'm almost 50, has also coincided with this sort of deeply flawed economic system. The New Economics Foundation was created in 1984 when Margaret Thatcher, the then British Prime Minister, was hosting the G7 group of leaders of the biggest countries, including Ronald Reagan. And NEF was created because it was a reaction to this idea that there was a rising economic orthodoxy, neoliberalism, some people call it, Reaganomics, Thatcherism, whatever you want to call it. And even then they were worried that left unchecked, this economic system, capitalism, modern capitalism, late capitalism, whatever you want to call it, was going to ruin the planet, damage people's lives, prevent the development of third world countries, as they called it at the time, and so on. And I do feel responsible, Pierre, in some ways, because our generation has sort of tolerated this stuff, right? We haven't called it out. We haven't stood up and said enough. We can't keep doing this. And so, for me, part of it is also owning up to our responsibility. We're not directly responsible, but I think there's been a sort of failure to call to account some of what's going on around us, or a complicity, I suppose, is what I feel in part. But I still remain hopeful because I think, for the points you said earlier, we've made this mess and we can also fix the mess. And that's, to me, what the SDGs are about as well. I was there in those early days as the SDGs were being designed. I was in the hall in the UN General Assembly the day that they were passed. And for me, this is about saying, another world is possible. We can fix this. Here's how. Here's the roadmap. Here's Agenda 2030. So I think ingredient number one is just this idea that we can fix this. And here, for example, is the roadmap. Ingredient number two is meaningful engagement. I often think that some of the sort of meetings that, young people are invited to, or civil society leaders like me are invited to, I often say that they're like insultations, not consultations, right? You're just sort of say, oh, come around, let's, we want to hear your views, but it's tokenistic. It's an insult, really. And that's because these institutions, these powerful institutions we've created, are good at paying lip service to engaging young people or marginalized communities or diverse voices. But actually, it's done in a very shallow, often tokenistic way. And so ingredient number two is, really meaningfully consult and empower people. If you're going to do a youth advisory group, give them the power to change your organizational strategy. Give them the power to change the policy, because that will not only make you a better, more sustainable organization or the initiative better, but it will then have that positive feedback loop where people will say, hey, actually, this is great. I can change the world, and I can, I'm not just being sort of used as a sort of in a charade of consultation. So I think that's two. And then the third is comes back to the sort of role of technology. And not everyone will necessarily agree with me, but I do think that we have no choice but to lean into the sort of digital disruption that we see around us. It's really, in some ways it's awful given the sort of how unlevel the playing field. We've got, some people living, earning billions using Bitcoin, and there are billions of people who don't even have access to the internet still, right? So it's a hugely unlevel playing field. But I think a third way for me is to sort of think, well, it's not if we lean in, if we have these sort of digital disruptions and transformations, it's how we manage what is inevitably coming down our way and harness those tools and platforms and techniques to empower, connect people around the world. And so I think because a lot of I think maybe our generation often assumes that this is, we've done it this way. So like a good example is organizations. I work for what's called a registered charity, a non-profit organization. It has a registered status. It had salaried staff. I'm dialing in from our office. the organizations of the future almost certainly won't look like this, right? We've already seen how organizations of the future are being created online, so-called digital autonomous organizations where, all of the transactions are on an open ledger. It's much more participatory in the way that it's governed. It's much more democratic and less hierarchical. And so I think there's a third lesson in there for me about engaging young people by leaning into some of that disruption and say, well, hey, help us design the next generation of institutions, the next generations of platforms that will help us do this and leapfrog some of the outdated ones that we've come to rely on.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned cooperatives in sort of the economic sphere of being a far more just way of running businesses, etc., you also mentioned civic assemblies and as an example of that more sort of true participatory democracy. And maybe that's a way in terms of, because as you say, with not AI, but technology, online technology, town council meetings. You've seen it on the East Coast of America. I don't know whether they still do it. In Vermont, there were town council meetings where people actually have a direct say in the governing of their lives. And it seems to me, as you say, that as you suggest, that there are online possibilities that people can actually engage on actually quite a small issues and have their say in their locality, and the young should be really encouraged and enabled to have that say, and shape. Yeah. Sorry, Danny. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, it can be on small issues, but it can also be on big global ones, right? On climate change, there was an attempt a few years ago to have citizens' assemblies in, consultations with sort of random representative groups of people around the world on what should happen around climate action. To me, it was really inspiring because here, arguably the biggest global threat facing humanity, where our elected politicians, or worse still, the unelected diplomats who negotiate at these big international meetings, are failing us. But when you ask representative groups of people to look at what should be done, they're much more ambitious, much more willing to sacrifice, a few creature comforts for the sake of long-term sustainability, less beholden to vested interests and powerful groups. And as I said, most importantly, by involving people in that way, you're also re-energizing politics and decision-making to be much more participatory and deliberative. And so, whether it's in the town hall in Vermont or global decision-making on what needs to happen on climate action, we can be much more participatory, if we want to. And I think we need to.
But it requires that sort of bottom-up approach, doesn't it, in terms of demanding that, I suppose. Another thing that really made me think, and it really rung true again in your book, is that oftentimes those people who are marginalised, who are living on a minimum wage, are living in poverty, are the least likely people to become civically engaged. Not because they don't care, but often because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, maybe they're a single parent, maybe they don't have the confidence or feel that they're entitled to actually participate in whatever civic activity. It doesn't have to be politics necessarily. And yet it feels to me that if we exclude people like the young and those who suffer most, then we're not going to reach a decisive engagement really with power and making it more democratic. What do you say to that? How, is it the same sort of issue as the young with people who, as you say, I think a lot of the failings of call it progressive or the left or people who want a more just society is that often it's dominated by middle class people, well-meaning, well-intentioned, but actually you don't hear the voices of the people that need to be heard. I don't know whether you've got anything sort of to say to that, really.
Yeah. Well, look, there is a sort of contradiction in some ways because, if I look back at my career, some of the most inspiring people I've met in my life are people who've you know, sacrificed a huge amount, taken huge risks to speak up for the marginalized, the voiceless, the discriminated against. So it's, you know, environmental activists in Central America, you know, who sadly are still being picked off and killed because they dare to speak up against dams being built or rainforests being plowed over. There are, you know, indigenous rights activists in Australia that I knew as a child who lived in atrocious conditions, but still found time and ways of speaking truth to power. When I lived in South Africa, there were LGBTI activists or women's rights groups from the sort of shanty towns, if you will, from the townships, who had almost next to nothing when it comes to sort of traditional economic wealth, but had huge wealth, social wealth, power, and they were amplifying Dalit movements in India, pro-democracy activists in the Middle East. And, you know, and that's, you know, again, one of the reasons I'm hopeful that there are people who are still willing, despite all that's going on, to speak up for what matters and for the greater good. But you're also right, and this is where the contradiction is, that in many parts of the world, we rely or assume that people will just have the time and interest to participate. Yes, of course, you know, but what inevitably happens is only those people who do have time because they've got, you know, stable jobs or they've got wealth behind them or they're retired or whatever else have the ability to engage in these mechanisms. So it sort of ends up a sort of lazy assumption that society or institutions make about who is able to participate. And I think all the lessons from around the world suggest that you've got to be more intentional, more thoughtful. You've got to create opportunities. You've got to pay people for the time sometimes to engage. You know, so the sort of meaningful engagement requires an intentional approach to being inclusive, if you will, of diverse voices. So I think that is important. And again, the how will matter as much as the what. I mean, that's my point. Like in the book, you can't achieve climate justice unless you empower people. You can't achieve economic justice unless you create more empowering economic systems and so on. And so in the same way, those of us who care about civic freedoms or democracy need also to care about the mechanisms through which we want to engage people and in the conversation. And it's true for the SDGs as well, by the way. You know, I do sometimes worry that the SDGs have become, you know, it's fashionable and known at the sort of elites in societies, but very few people in the rest of the world know it. And I used to worry that we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to make the SDGs famous. You know, people who design the badge and the logo, that's all good. I have no problem with that. But almost everyone I know who wears an SDG logo on their lapel is part of some form of elite, right? Including myself. I'm putting myself in that category. Whereas I would argue that more than making the SDGs famous, we should be thinking about how to make them useful. And useful for people whose lives are precarious, who are living in the face of climate breakdown. How do we use this amazing global framework that we have to help strengthen the arm of climate activists, of youth activists, of environmentalists, of gender activists, and people who want to hold their own governments to account? And I think that's the bit that we need to put energy in, both for both reasons, right? Both because we want to achieve the SDGs, but also because that was another way of empowering local action and civic life. And that's why I still believe this is an amazing framework, because this should be the sort of thing we should be holding our national governments to account, or businesses to account, or local authorities to account, saying, why did you stand up in 2015 and say that you were committed to this agenda? But actually today, you don't seem to be doing very much about it. In fact, in some areas, you're going backwards. It's the sort of the use of the SDGs as a sort of accountability mechanism that I think we need to pay some more attention to, both, again, for the delivery, but also for the participatory potential in it.
Yeah, I mean, again, that rings true. I meet very few people. When we contact people, most people, even progressive people, are not aware. They've never heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think because it's been a top-down process, I think, as we say, it has to be people have to be engaged with it. And it strikes us that actually, what you need is something similar to the transition town movement, where you have a sustainable Colchester or a sustainable Coventry or whatever, where the SDGs are the framework.
Yeah.
It may well be that the community doesn't relate, or it doesn't relate to life underwater or whatever, or certain of the SDGs, but they certainly will be impacted by issues that relate to most of the SDGs. And it's that bottom-up approach that, as you say, if you hold people to account, first of all, hold local politicians to account. And if you've got a vibrant movement that is putting pressure on local politicians, they will take notice. And then that builds up to the regional and then the national level. It's frustrating that we don't have a movement that is rooted in the SDGs. And there's still time, and we've still got 5 years. And I imagine that there will be something similar to the SDGs afterwards. Again, I think it's the how we get to realising SDGs is the critical point. And as you've alluded to, that often people in developing countries are being affected most by a lot of the issues that the SDGs cover. I used to have when I was younger, I used to have a poster above my bed that said, "Think globally, act locally," which was quite a buzzword or term back in the 80s, 70s and 80s. And I just wonder how you think we could connect people across borders to realise or to get closer to realising the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah. Well, by the way, I'm still a fan of think globally, act locally. I think that still works for me because I think that is exactly the sort of approach we need. And because we do need the sort of local action, the local connections, the local community building that for all the reasons I've spoken about. But we are lost if we don't pay attention to the global, because so many of the challenges we face need to be addressed at the global level. As I said, our politicians are spectacularly failing to address the global issues that matter today, whether it's climate breakdown, whether it's aid and humanitarian relief, whether it's tax justice and tax evasion. There's so many the frontiers of what needs to happen through global cooperation are really important. And, there's some promising news there because there's some data that suggests that people are more interested in the global and more aware that the global matters to their lives than I think we often think or politicians assume. So, there was a survey done in many countries recently that showed that, in countries like the UK and Canada, roughly equal percentages of people, about a third each, feel that they're part of, they think of themselves as global citizens as they do citizens of their own country. Interestingly, in countries like South Africa, India, and China, a greater proportion of people feel that they're citizens of the world than they do feel citizens of their own countries, right? And that's higher amongst young people generally across all those countries surveyed. And I think that is again, I don't think we can put the globalization genie back in the bottle either, right? We have connected a thoroughly interconnected world in almost every way, whether it's goods and services, capital, tourism, ideas, culture. We are so deeply interconnected. And so I think we do need new mechanisms for addressing that interconnectedness, whether that's finding new ways of connecting people. And again, that's where technology will help, and translation mechanisms and AI and all of that will help us do that more effectively. Or it could be about decision making. And there too, I think you can, there are some creative ideas for how we bring people's voice into global decision making. One idea I love is why not create a people's chamber at the United Nations that sits alongside the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, each member state gets one vote. There are, diplomats who do the horse trading and the negotiating. But in the People's Assembly, you might have people, randomly selected from around the world from population who might not make decisions as such, but who can bring different and diverse voices and approaches to bear on global issues. So it becomes a sort of chamber of debate and discourse. chamber of review to look at what our the lower assembly, if you will, the General Assembly might do. So that's just one idea, but there's tons of ideas of how we can bring the global to life in more meaningful ways that makes people feel connected, but also will improve the quality of decision making at the global level, which we so desperately need.
Yeah, and those structures, as we've said, those structures like the global assembly. I mean, that can be a local level as well, and at every level you can have those changes. Just as much as we talked about citizens' assemblies, and they can have not necessarily power, but politicians and those who make the big decisions need to listen. Will need to listen to them. That's interesting. It sort of comes back to what you said about when you were involved with Civicus. You were chief exec of Civicus, which I think was the world's largest civil society organisation. And you and your team were quite involved, I think, with the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've talked about the SDGs, and we've had 10 years, we've got 5 years left. You kind of said how you think it's going, that it's problematic, but do you think there's time left to actually put some excitement and energy back into the SDGs so that they'll be taken up by people?
Yes, there is time left to. So we definitely need to up our game. Right, we need a sort of step change in the way that the world is approaching any of the major goals that we're talking about. And time is running out, but the sooner we act and achieve that step change, the better. More lives will be saved, and the more chances we're able to avoid sort of catastrophic climate breakdown, for example. So we have to get moving. I still remain inspired by the SDGs. Being involved in those processes in 2012, 13, 14, and the lead up to the agreement of the SDGs for me was important because, the Millennium Development Goals, which preceded them in some ways, were about poverty in the poorest countries of the world and was about aid budgets and what can the global North do for the global South and all of that. That was important. The SDGs were transformative because it was acknowledging that actually this is about all of us. Yes, it needs some aid, and yes, it's about poverty. That's really important. It's at the heart of the goals, the first few goals. But it's not just about that. And it's not just about governments, not about aid. It's about businesses. It's about civil society. It's about partnerships. It's about inequality. It's about sustainability. And so, yes, we could tweak the framework here and there, and we could say, we could have another goal here. Fine. But more importantly, I can't think of a better roadmap for what we need to do around the world. And as you say, yes, we said it was set as Agenda 2030, so we've got 5 and a bit years left. Almost certainly we'll need something else that succeeds it. Maybe we can improve a little bit. But we really should be thinking of the SDGs as the global roadmap to a more just and sustainable future. And everyone at every level needs to be doing more towards delivering that and be held accountable for that. So as you said rightly, why shouldn't a local councillor in the borough that you live or the county that you live be thinking about the SDGs as a framework for informing their local action and ideally report against how they're doing to say, yeah, look, this is how sustainable we are becoming, or what we're doing on gender equality in our area, and it's a global frame. So I'm not saying it's one size fits all when it comes to what people should do. Their approach should be, to suit the local context, but the framework is there for us to say this is the concerted action by all of humanity to deliver a fairer, better world.
Yeah, and it's interesting sort of relating that to, sort of cross-border things. SDG Vision was born out of our inspiration from a charity that you're familiar with, Partners for Change Ethiopia, Injecto, in Ethiopia. And they work with local communities, enable people to come together, and they hit virtually all of the SDGs because they see everything as being interrelated. And I think that's why the framework is so important. is that nothing exists in isolation, and that, if we have a positive impact on one SDG, then it might impact on another SDG, because you can't really separate them. So I think that's really interesting. And also your work with the New Economics Foundation. I like the way you term it's a think and do tank. I think that's really refreshing. And perhaps you could say how that contributes to the SDGs.
Yeah, look, NEF, long before I started, has thought of itself as a think and do tank. And I think it's a do tank because in some ways, if we're going to show another world is possible, it's got to go beyond the theoretical, beyond the policy idea, and showing that, and we're trying to do that at different scales and different levels. So, for example, in Manchester in the UK, we're working with the mayor and some local civil society actors to create what we're calling a living income demonstration. A living income is this notion that, all of us should have access to a decent income that can live a dignified life, but also that the services around us should be universal and accessible, whether it's, welfare services or social services, health, education, and stuff like that. And so, create this idea that, or show that it's possible to have a fundable and sustainable system that genuinely provides for people in a meaningful way, rather than forces them into poverty even though they're working hard, long hours, or leaves them punished by the state because they're disabled and unable to work in the way that the state demands them to. So that's an example of a do tank ability to show that another world is possible. We could treat each other very differently on the basis of mutuality, of compassion, rather than distrust, and that it leads to better outcomes. It'll be cheaper in the long run for the state, and so on. And and again, the good news is there's people all over the world who are doing all sorts of things like that to show that another world is possible. You talked about community power earlier. I talked about the digital cooperative in Turkey and so on. And I think it is time that we sort of shine a light on these examples so that it inspires others, it convinces skeptics, and it inspires young people or others who feel hopeless, because this is where, we need to sort of show, not tell, if you will, that change is possible. And that's part of what we're trying to do here at NEF.
Terrific. And that's what we're trying to do at SDG Vision as well. And I think that this conversation has been so useful, because I think that I would really encourage people to read this book, because I think that it does talk about the problems, but it talks about the solutions as well, and that the solutions are out there already, and that we just need to take inspiration from them. Danny, thank you very much indeed. It's been really fascinating talking with you, and hopefully we'll catch up at some point in the future.
No, thanks very much, Pierre. It's been fun.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now, if you enjoyed that, go and have a look at their film and many, many others on sdg.vision.